What if the advice you have been following to fix your blood sugar has been making it harder to fix all along? Not slightly harder, fundamentally, structurally harder, in a way that keeps you stuck on the same medications, watching the same numbers, having the same frustrating conversation at every appointment, while the real solution sits untouched in a grocery store aisle nobody pointed you toward. Here is what almost no one says out loud. You do not have to remove carbohydrates to fix your blood sugar. The fastest path to lower numbers is not about elimination at all. It is about addition. Specific foods, added in a specific way, that work directly on the biological mechanism underneath the problem, not around it, not on top of it, but at the cellular level where insulin resistance actually lives. This is not a theory. These are foods with documented, measurable effects on blood glucose, fasting numbers, and long-term A1C. And every single one of them works by addressing something your doctor almost certainly never had the appointment time to explain to you. 10 foods, 3 jobs, 1 mechanism. And by the end of this, you will understand your own blood sugar better than most people who have been managing it for decades. Before anything else, here is the one thing you need to understand about what is actually happening inside your body. Because without this, the rest of the list is just ingredients. High blood sugar in adults over 50 almost never starts with the pancreas. It starts upstream, with a hormone called insulin, and more specifically, with what happens when your cells stop listening to it. Insulin is the key. Glucose, the sugar that enters your bloodstream after every meal, is the passenger. The cell is the destination. Insulin's job is to unlock the cell door so glucose can enter and be used as fuel. That is the system working correctly. But when that system has been under chronic stress for years, from processed food, from inflammation, from inactivity, from sustained elevated blood sugar, the cells begin to ignore the key. Insulin knocks. The door stays shut. The glucose has nowhere to go and remains in the bloodstream where it does not belong. This is insulin resistance. And the standard medical response to insulin resistance is to flood the system with more insulin, either by stimulating the pancreas to produce it or by injecting it directly. More knocking at a door that is already refusing to answer. The numbers come down temporarily because you are forcing them down. The underlying resistance quietly worsens because the root mechanism was never addressed. The foods about to be described do not force anything. They work on the mechanism. Some of them slow the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream in the first place, so the system never gets overwhelmed. Some of them reduce the inflammation that is physically blocking the insulin signal at the cell surface. Some of them reactivate the insulin receptor itself, so the cell starts answering the door again without pharmaceutical pressure. That is 3 completely different biological jobs, and all 10 of these foods perform at least one of them with evidence behind them. Add them in over the next 2 weeks. Stack them. You are not rebuilding your diet. You are adding targeted tools to what you are already doing. The first food is fenugreek seeds. These are small, hard, amber-colored seeds available in the spice section of almost any grocery store for a few dollars. Most people walk past them without a second look, which means most people are walking past one of the most direct blood sugar interventions available without a prescription. Inside the fenugreek seed is a soluble fiber called galactomannan. When this fiber reaches the water in your stomach, it swells into a dense, viscous gel. That gel physically slows the rate at which your stomach empties carbohydrates into the small intestine, which slows the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream. No flood, no spike, no emergency dump of insulin from a pancreas that is already strained. But fenugreek does not stop there. It also contains an amino acid called 4-hydroxyisoleucine that appears to directly stimulate insulin secretion in a glucose-dependent way, meaning it helps your own pancreas respond more efficiently when glucose actually arrives. And it improves muscle cell uptake of glucose, which is one of the key sites of insulin resistance. Soak 1 teaspoon of the whole seeds in a glass of water overnight. In the morning, drink the water and eat the softened seeds before breakfast. If the flavor, which is slightly bitter and distinctive, is too strong at first, grind the seeds and stir half a teaspoon into yogurt or add it to scrambled eggs. Start with a small amount and give your gut a few days to adjust. The fiber is potent, and the digestive system needs a short runway. The second food is cinnamon, and the specific type matters more than almost anyone realizes. There are 2 main forms of cinnamon available in stores: cassia, which is the common dark reddish-brown variety found in most grocery stores, and Ceylon, sometimes labeled as true cinnamon, which is lighter in color, milder in flavor, and structurally different in its chemical composition. Cassia cinnamon contains a compound called coumarin in concentrations high enough to stress the liver with daily use over time. Ceylon cinnamon contains negligible amounts. If the goal is to use cinnamon as a daily blood sugar tool, Ceylon is the version worth using. What makes it work is a family of plant compounds called polyphenols that behave, in a specific and limited way, similarly to insulin at the receptor level. They help the insulin receptor grip glucose more effectively, and they independently slow gastric emptying, adding another layer of glucose regulation at the point of absorption. Research published through the USDA Human Nutrition Program found that less than half a teaspoon per day produced measurable reductions in fasting blood glucose in adults with type 2 diabetes. The effect size is real, and the tool costs essentially nothing if you already have it in the house. A quarter to half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon daily is the practical target, stirred into coffee, oatmeal, a smoothie, or yogurt. The most effective timing is with a carbohydrate-containing meal, which is precisely when you want the receptor sensitization and the gastric slowing to be active simultaneously. The third food on this list is the most underused, and the distinction within it matters enormously. Broccoli sprouts. Not mature broccoli, the 3-day-old sprouts. Mature broccoli is nutritionally valuable. Broccoli sprouts at 3 days of growth contain somewhere between 50 and 100 times more of a specific compound called sulforaphane than the fully grown vegetable. That is not a marginal difference. It is a categorically different dose of a categorically important molecule. Sulforaphane does something none of the other foods on this list do with the same directness. It targets the liver and suppresses gluconeogenesis, the process by which your liver manufactures glucose overnight and releases it into your bloodstream while you sleep. In people with insulin resistance, this overnight glucose production is dysregulated. The liver produces far more glucose than the body needs, and people wake up with a fasting number significantly higher than the one they went to sleep with. No meal consumed, no sugar eaten. The liver made it during the night. Research published within the last decade by scientists at Lund University in Sweden demonstrated that concentrated sulforaphane reduced fasting blood glucose in people with type 2 diabetes, with the most significant effects in individuals whose baseline numbers were hardest to control through other means. A small handful, roughly a quarter cup, of broccoli sprouts on a salad, a sandwich, or alongside eggs, most days of the week. Raw or barely wilted. Heat above a certain threshold destroys the enzymatic process that produces sulforaphane, so cooking them thoroughly defeats the purpose. You can grow them at home in a glass jar on a counter for almost no cost, or purchase them in the produce section of most grocery stores. The investment of attention here pays off in a way that is measurable on a glucose meter within a few weeks. The fourth food is avocado, and the fear around it has cost people who needed it. For years, the caloric density of avocado, driven by its fat content, positioned it as something to moderate or avoid. That framing ignored what the fat actually is and what it does inside the body. The fat in an avocado is predominantly monounsaturated fat, the same family of fat found in olive oil, and widely recognized as one of the most metabolically favorable forms of dietary fat available. Monounsaturated fat does not spike blood sugar. It does not trigger insulin release. What it does is slow the entire meal down. When half an avocado is added to a plate that contains carbohydrates, the fat and fiber together extend the time it takes for the stomach to empty its contents into the small intestine. The glucose from those carbohydrates is released into the bloodstream at a fraction of the speed it would have been without the avocado. The spike flattens into a gradual, manageable rise. The pancreas responds proportionally instead of in emergency mode. Over sustained periods, diets rich in monounsaturated fat have also been associated with improved insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. The cell membrane itself becomes more fluid and receptive to insulin signaling when the fat profile of the diet shifts in this direction. Half an avocado daily is a practical and sustainable target. On eggs in the morning, mashed onto whole grain bread, added to a salad that contains a starchy component. Anywhere there is a carbohydrate, avocado softens what it does to your blood sugar. The fifth food is chia seeds, and their mechanism is visible to the naked eye. Drop a tablespoon of chia seeds into a glass of water and return 15 minutes later. What you will find is a thick, gelatinous mass. That transformation, hydrophilic fiber absorbing water and expanding, is exactly what happens in your stomach when chia seeds arrive with a meal. Chia is one of the most concentrated sources of soluble fiber available in whole food form. That gel formation inside the stomach physically encases carbohydrate molecules and slows their enzymatic breakdown and absorption. The glucose that those carbohydrates would have released rapidly into the bloodstream is instead released gradually, over a significantly extended period. The spike becomes a gentle slope. The crash that follows a spike, the shakiness, the sudden hunger, the craving for something sweet an hour after eating, largely disappears. Chia also contains plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, which contribute to the anti-inflammatory effect that is critical for insulin sensitivity. Cool the inflammation, and the insulin receptor starts responding again. 1 to 2 tablespoons daily, stirred into yogurt, blended into a smoothie, dropped into a glass of water with lemon. Let it sit for 10 minutes before consuming so the gel can form. Drink adequate water alongside because soluble fiber in volume without sufficient hydration can cause digestive discomfort. The sixth food works on a completely different layer of the problem. Fatty fish, specifically salmon and mackerel, do not primarily slow glucose absorption. They address the chronic, low-grade inflammatory environment that is physically blocking insulin signaling at the cell surface. Insulin resistance is not simply a pancreatic problem or a glucose metabolism problem. It is, at its foundation, an inflammatory problem. Years of processed food, excess visceral fat, elevated blood sugar itself, and sedentary patterns create a state of chronic systemic inflammation. That inflammation deposits itself at the level of the cell membrane and physically disrupts the insulin receptor's ability to receive and respond to insulin's signal. The key is trying to turn in a damaged lock. Salmon and mackerel are among the most concentrated whole food sources of EPA and DHA, the two long-chain omega-3 fatty acids with the most directly documented anti-inflammatory effects in human tissue. They reduce the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, improve the structural integrity of cell membranes, and appear to improve insulin receptor function as a downstream consequence of reducing the inflammatory interference. 2 servings per week, each roughly the size of an open palm. Wild salmon, mackerel, sardines, herring, all qualify. Baked, grilled, or purchased canned. Canned sardines and mackerel represent some of the most cost-effective and nutritionally dense items available in any grocery store, and they require no preparation. The 7th food is walnuts, and among all nuts, this is the one worth prioritizing specifically for blood sugar management. Walnuts are uniquely rich in polyunsaturated fat and in alpha-linolenic acid, the plant form of omega-3, which adds an anti-inflammatory layer on top of the blood sugar stabilizing effect of the fat, fiber, and protein combination. That combination, healthy fat plus fiber plus plant protein, blunts the post-meal glucose rise in a way that is straightforward and consistent. But walnuts also act on something that rarely gets discussed in blood sugar conversations: fasting insulin. Not fasting glucose, which is what most people measure, but fasting insulin, the level circulating in your blood when you have not eaten recently, which reflects how hard your pancreas has been working just to maintain baseline. Elevated fasting insulin is one of the earliest and most sensitive indicators of developing insulin resistance, and it tends to normalize before blood glucose does when interventions are working. Regular walnut consumption has been associated with reductions in fasting insulin in clinical studies, suggesting it is working upstream on the resistance mechanism itself, not just dampening the numbers after meals. A small handful daily, approximately a quarter cup or 7 to 10 whole walnuts, raw or dry roasted, used to replace a processed snack, not added on top of one. The goal is substitution, not addition. The 8th food has been unfairly demonized for years, and the practical consequence of that misinformation is that millions of people abandoned it for breakfast options that are categorically worse for blood sugar. Whole eggs, yolk included. The concern about dietary cholesterol from egg yolks drove a generation of people away from one of the most blood sugar neutral breakfast options available and towards cereal, toast, and juice, which create exactly the morning glucose spike that sets a difficult metabolic tone for the entire day. A whole egg contains essentially no carbohydrate. It does not raise blood sugar on its own in any meaningful way. What it does that is more valuable than its direct glycemic effect is something called the second meal effect. A breakfast anchored by whole eggs produces a hormonal and satiety response that measurably reduces the glucose spike of the next meal, hours later. You eat eggs at 7 in the morning, and your blood sugar response to lunch is calmer than it would have been if you had started the day with a bowl of cereal. The stabilizing effect extends beyond the meal itself. The protein and fat in eggs also produce a sustained satiety response that eliminates the mid-morning hunger spike that drives people toward processed snacks between breakfast and lunch. That snacking pattern, driven by a blood sugar crash caused by a high glycemic breakfast, disappears when the first meal of the day is built around eggs. 2 to 3 whole eggs in the morning, scrambled, boiled, poached, prepared in advance if the morning is short on time. Pair them with the avocado from earlier and a handful of broccoli sprouts, and the breakfast alone is doing 3 separate jobs on the blood sugar mechanism before the day has properly begun. The ninth food produces the fastest visible effect of anything on this list, and it is something that has been sitting in grocery stores for decades, at a price point that makes its clinical relevance almost absurd. Apple cider vinegar. The active compound is acetic acid. It works through 2 simultaneous mechanisms. First, it slows gastric emptying, reducing the speed at which carbohydrates from the meal move into the small intestine and then into the bloodstream as glucose. Second, it appears to improve glucose uptake in skeletal muscle, helping the muscles pull glucose out of the blood and use it as fuel more effectively in the hours following a meal. Research led by Dr. Carol Johnston at Arizona State University demonstrated that 1 tablespoon of vinegar consumed before a carbohydrate-containing meal reduced the post-meal blood glucose spike by approximately 20% in adults with insulin resistance. A 20% reduction from 1 tablespoon of a substance that costs a few dollars and has no meaningful side effects at this dose is a significant clinical number. 1 tablespoon diluted in a full glass of water consumed 10 to 15 minutes before the largest carbohydrate meal of the day. Dilution is not optional. Undiluted acetic acid is corrosive to tooth enamel and the esophagus over time. Always dilute. Always consume through the water, not straight. If blood sugar medication is already part of the daily regimen, speak with a prescribing physician before adding apple cider vinegar as a daily practice. The combination of medication and vinegar can lower blood sugar faster than the medication dose was calibrated for, and that can push numbers dangerously low. The 10th food proves the central point of this entire conversation in a single example, because it is a carbohydrate, and it will lower your blood sugar. Lentils. Lentils are built from resistant starch, a form of carbohydrate that the small intestine cannot rapidly digest, wrapped in a dense layer of soluble fiber, with a significant amount of plant protein in the same package. The result is a carbohydrate that releases glucose into the bloodstream slowly, steadily, and over an extended period, rather than in a single rapid wave. Lentils also carry the second meal effect. A serving of lentil soup at lunch produces measurably calmer blood sugar in response to whatever is eaten at dinner. The regulatory effect of the meal extends beyond the meal itself, which is a property shared only by a small number of foods, and is one of the most valuable characteristics a blood sugar food can have. Swapping white rice or white potato for lentils 2 or 3 times per week is one of the most reliable single dietary changes available for reducing A1C over a 3-month period. Not because lentils are a superfood in a marketing sense, but because they are doing the exact opposite of what refined starch does. They are slowing glucose delivery, feeding the gut microbiome, and extending post-meal satiety simultaneously. Half a cup to a cup of cooked lentils several times per week. In a soup, a stew, a cold salad dressed with olive oil and a splash of the apple cider vinegar just discussed. Inexpensive, filling, and more effective for blood sugar management than most foods marketed specifically for that purpose. Now consider someone who came in recently, a 63-year-old woman in the first year of retirement, frightened because her fasting glucose had been sitting around 180, and her physician had just recommended adding a second medication. She had watched her mother lose toes and then her vision to the same disease, and she was terrified of where the trajectory was heading. She did not want to spend the rest of her life climbing a medication ladder 1 rung at a time. Nothing was eliminated. Carbohydrates were not banned. Her entire diet was not rebuilt. What changed was what was added. Eggs and avocado in the morning instead of cereal. A tablespoon of apple cider vinegar before her larger meals. Lentils replacing white rice several times per week. A small handful of walnuts replacing the afternoon cookie. Fatty fish appearing on the menu twice a week. Ceylon cinnamon in her morning coffee. Broccoli sprouts on her sandwich at lunch. Fenugreek seeds soaked overnight and consumed before breakfast. Within the first week, her fasting numbers began to move in a direction they had not moved in years. Within 3 months, in coordination with her physician, she had reduced off the second medication entirely. Her A1C had moved from the diabetic range back toward normal. More than 2 years later, those numbers have held. She did not eat less. She ate differently, and her own body did the rest. This is what reversing insulin resistance actually looks like at the cellular level. Not forcing glucose down with increasingly aggressive pharmaceutical intervention, but addressing the mechanism. Slowing the glucose delivery so the system never panics. Cooling the inflammation so the receptor can hear the signal again. Providing the specific compounds that help the receptor respond when insulin arrives. Do that meal after meal, day after day, and the cell that stopped answering the door begins to open it again before the knocking is even finished. Once that happens, the body holds the glucose down on its own. Not because the medication is stronger, but because the system has been given back the inputs it needed to function the way it was designed to function. One boundary needs to be stated clearly. If insulin or a sulfonylurea class medication is currently part of the regimen, these foods can lower blood sugar with enough speed and consistency that the existing medication dose may become too high for the body's improved insulin sensitivity. Blood sugar can drop below safe levels. This is not a reason to avoid these foods. It is a reason to add them with a physician monitoring the numbers, so the medication can be adjusted downward as the body improves. Add the foods. Show the list to the prescribing doctor. Let them manage the medication reduction. Do not stop any prescription unilaterally. Here is what to begin tonight. Before the morning, soak a teaspoon of fenugreek seeds in a glass of water. That is the preparation for tomorrow's first step. Tomorrow morning, replace whatever is currently being eaten for breakfast with 2 or 3 whole eggs and half an avocado. That single swap changes the blood sugar pattern not just at breakfast, but throughout the entire day. Tomorrow, purchase Ceylon cinnamon if it is not already in the house, and begin a 1/4 teaspoon daily in coffee or oatmeal. Before the largest carbohydrate meal tomorrow, dilute 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in a full glass of water and drink it 15 minutes before eating. This week, swap white rice or white potato for lentils at least twice, and put fatty fish on the menu on 2 evenings. The numbers on the glucose meter are not permanent. They are a reflection of what the system is receiving and how it is responding. Change the inputs deliberately and systematically, and the outputs change. Not in theory, on the meter, in the blood draw, in the A1C at the next appointment. The mechanism was always capable of working correctly. It was waiting for the right conditions to begin working again. The question worth asking now is not whether these foods will lower blood sugar. The evidence on that is clear. The question is why the conversation at the appointment never reached this level of detail, and what else about your own biology has been waiting for an explanation that the 12-minute visit never had time to provide. Because if the overnight fasting number is still rising while you sleep, even after everything covered here, there is a separate mechanism running in the liver while the body rests that none of these 10 foods directly addresses in isolation. That mechanism has a name, a clear explanation, and a specific set of interventions that work on it precisely. That is the next conversation worth having. And the number you wake up to tomorrow morning, before a single bite of food, will tell you whether it applies to you.